Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Tuesday. I want us to look again at the Word of God for one of my favorite subjects, that is God's grace manifested to a sinful, fallen man. And God's grace is available to help us through difficult times and circumstances, as Paul testified in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says in verse 7, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. And for this thing I besought the Lord 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." You see, first of all, the Apostle Paul is giving an account of some glorious revelations that the Lord has allowed him to experience. And he says, I could glory in all that, but I won't. You see, God knew my tendency to think too highly of myself in this, so he allowed a messenger of Satan, a thorn in the flesh, he calls it here. We don't really know what this malady was. Paul calls it the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure, so that I wouldn't brag about what God had allowed in my life, but I'd brag on the Lord instead. Apparently, this thorn in the flesh was some troubling feature for Paul to contend with. Although we don't know what it was that hounded him over and over. Some believe it might have been a speech impediment. If it was, Paul certainly overcame that by the grace of God and preached to the masses on several different occasions. Some surmise that it might have been a problem with his eyesight. There is one letter where Paul writes a portion of it himself, and he said, "You see what a large letter I have written in my own hand." Well, whatever we may think that thorn in the flesh is, it really doesn't matter. The point is that Paul prayed on 3 different occasions that the Lord would remove this thorn for his relief and for his comfort. But the Lord refused to do so. Instead, his answer was, "My grace is sufficient for thee." In other words, God has said he would do a work in Paul to compensate for the thorn. And his reasoning was, "My strength is made perfect in your weakness." You may not realize my work in you without this aspect going on. You may not notice it without facing this trouble or this thorn. We need to know today that God's grace, his unmerited favor toward us, is always enough. It will help us through the most difficult times, the most difficult circumstances, if we will only learn to lean on him and accept his grace, his mercy. Paul's testimony was, "Most gladly will I rather glory in my infirmities, that I may see the power of Christ working in me." That is what happens when we understand God's grace and are willing to accept it in our lives.